Hi everyone, I'm David Vaucher, and this is Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there to learn how to find, maintain, and grow long term sponsorship relationships. If you're interested in finding out more, please visit the Vaucher Analytics website at www.vaucheranalytics.com and use the navigation links at the top right hand of your screen. Now, I know talking about the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator is a little bit paradoxical, at least it has been for the last couple of episodes, because this is the third of a four-part series which I've entitled Racing's Second Revolution. And this is about maybe not moving permanently away from sponsorship, but at least towards a paradigm where motorsport is less dependent on it. And in this third part, entitled The Roadmap to Move Away from Sponsorship and Towards Own Revenue, I'm going to chart the next part of that course. So, to recap, part one was diagnosis. Teams are fragile because they rent visibility from sponsors. Part two was foundation. And in this episode, I talked about storytelling being the infrastructure that makes a sport culturally alive. And I looked at what I think is the best example of this in all of sports today, and that's the National Football League's NFL films. Part three, today's episode, is about synthesis. And here I'm going to talk about cultural crossovers that are ubiquitous, or how teams and drivers turn meaning into independence and accessibility. And I'm going to look at that with some very well known case studies. First, though, I want to talk about this move from hype driven attention to ownership. Whereas many online personalities with tens or even hundreds of thousands of followers will lead their respective audiences to believe they are living the good life, there are so many stories out there of creators with large follower counts who in reality struggle because they fail to monetize that following. That's because their content feeds into what social media algorithms want: quick hit videos which generate an intense but fleeting emotion because one video is quickly scrolled over for the next. These audiences are entertained, sure, but they're not engaged. And this analogy is absolutely relevant to motorsport teams and drivers because if they can't pivot from content that satisfies an algorithm to content that they can truly own, they will continue to be reliant on uncertain sponsorship package sales. And I think we can all relate to this in some fashion. Everyone loves to watch and share all of the clips that are made by social media teams of driver duos before an F1 race. But let's be honest, we're probably not going to remember these by the next race. And also, I should be clear, the word I'm using, content, I know is a little bit nebulous. I'm talking here about social media content as we know it, but absolutely, when I say content, I mean anything that a team can create. So it could be a proprietary design on a t-shirt, it could be perhaps a car appearing in a music video. It's anything that a team can truly own and perhaps use to generate revenues down the line. Anyways, that aside, what I just mentioned was the thesis behind parts one and two, and part three, what we're talking about today, closes the loop. So in this installment, let's assume that a given motorsport series has put considerable effort into creating content as described before, and it's resonating well with fans and perhaps even started to get through to the general population. In other words, they have built a solid foundation on which teams and drivers can springboard to capitalize on the resulting excitement and interest. What then are the next steps for teams and drivers within that series to working towards truly lasting independent content? And how might this even lead to a transcendent driver or team, similar to Michael Jordan and or the Chicago Bulls of the 1990s? I want to make this clear by asking a what might be a provocative question. So we in the motorsport community care about Ayrton Senna and Michael Schumacher, but does anyone else? I mean, there's no shortage of mythical figures in the world of F1 alone, and it's common for hardcore race fans to trade stories about how they were at a track decades ago when Senna got pole, or when Schumacher made a move characteristic of his aggressive driving style. But what about more casual fans? What about the general public? I strongly doubt it. I strongly doubt that they have any recollection or even knowledge of these things happening. And while those are the biggest names of the last 35 years, there are many other accomplished drivers who might as well be invisible outside of motorsport circles, and this is despite their huge accomplishments. So Juan Manuel Fangio, Niki Lauda, Alan Prost, and on and on. And again, this is only in F1. If you ask someone to name a well-known rally figure, if they played video games nearly 30 years ago, you might hear about Colin McRae because of the Colin McRae Rally series. But what's the likelihood of hearing, for instance, Sebastian Loeb, Sebastian Ogier, or Kalle Rovanperä, to be even more current? Who knows about Alex Palou and IndyCar, but IndyCar fans, and motorsport fans outside of North America willing to branch out? There can only be a handful of truly transcendent figures in any sport. But for them to be almost totally lacking in one with as much cultural awareness as motorsport, in the sense that everyone knows that racing cars is something that happens regularly, well, to me, this is an indictment of the lack of identity that motorsport and its teams and drivers have created for themselves. This, again, is the fundamental messages of parts 1 and 2 in this series. If a team is just pursuing sponsorship to go racing, what is its identity, really? But if you're the National Football League with an NFL Films, or you're the NBA licensing its identity and logos to Starter to create truly iconic streetwear, the platform is there for cultural dominance, the emergence of transcendent figures, and yes, more standalone revenues that don't depend on outside support. There's a meme that in the 90s, at least in the US, everyone was somehow a Charlotte Hornets fan because of their iconic Starter brand jacket and turquoise color scheme. Believe it or not, I think you can draw a direct line from that example, among others, to the success that Michael Jordan had in becoming one of the world's most successful pitchmen, and how that status then further reinforced the NBA on its way to becoming known as a platform for some of the most stylish and influential athletes on the planet. So what's missing here is cultural ubiquity. I haven't yet mentioned Lewis Hamilton because he serves as a perfect case study for all the elements that need to line up perfectly for teams and drivers to use content as much as possible to craft their own identities and move as closely as possible to revenue streams that they control. Hamilton arrived in F1 in the maybe late 2000s, we can call it, and his dominant run occurred at a time when social media was still in its relative infancy. Crucially, Drive to Survive premiered towards the tail end of his reign. This is important because for most of his championship streak, Formula One did not have an established platform for its drivers. There is no doubt that Hamilton made waves with his interest in fashion and culture from the moment he started to express himself off track. But this is really only relative to how low profile drivers were at the time, and indeed going all the way back to the beginning of Formula One. Can you imagine how seismic Hamilton's impact would be in another timeline during which he actually made his debut today and had similar success? To tie all of this together, Senna and Schumacher existed at a time when Formula One was just not the global powerhouse it is presently. And let's be honest, those two were far too hyper-focused on racing to have any relevance outside of it anyways. Lewis Hamilton was perhaps the first driver to participate in activities outside of racing that had broad cultural appeal, but F1 just did not have the reach to make those appearances ubiquitous and to imprint himself and racing in the cultural fabric like the NBA, Michael Jordan, and the 1990s Chicago Bulls. So to put all of this together, and this is going to be a little bit hard to describe over a podcast, I'm going to describe to you a framework I've put together called the Voscia Analytics Relevance Pyramid for Monetizable IP. And I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I will link this in the show notes and you're welcome to go take a look, and hopefully everything will make sense as you look at it. But what I've done here is build up all of the themes that I've talked about in this series called Racing Second Revolution. So first, we have a pyramid building up from 5 different areas. We start with core product and performance. This is essentially, is the product good? And I think with a lot of motorsports series today, we can say that indeed it is. Then we have storytelling and media, and this is where a service such as NFL Films come into play. And then we have culture and collaboration, which I've alluded to with some of what Lewis Hamilton was doing when he would model red carpet looks going towards a race. Then we have this ubiquity aspect. So all of this feeds into itself. You have a solid platform, you have cultural and collaboration coming into play, you have these being ubiquitous, and then perhaps that leads to a transcendent icon. This is rare. I wouldn't plan anyone's business on it. But the important thing is that once we've established these 5, call them bricks on the pyramid, we then separate this into 2 different regions. Above storytelling and media, so right between layers 2 and 3, we have what I'm calling the independence line. Below this is about earning attention, and everything below still depends on sponsors. Everything above is about owning meaning. So once you've done the work to establishing a solid racing foundation, you can then move towards establishing some of this owned IP. And here, everything above this point can generate direct owned revenue. And the beauty is that above the independence line, so after the point where you're using ubiquitous culture and collaboration, everything is self-sustaining. So even if you don't necessarily have one transcendent icon, more exposure in general culture leads to more opportunities for exposure in general culture, and that leads to more opportunities for generating revenue. So at this point in the second series, or in this series called Racing Second Revolution, the work is over, and now what I'm calling the fun can really start, because this is where the only limit is creativity, and you could argue budget, of course. But the pyramid is a business model and a roadmap. Every team, series, and drivers sits somewhere on it, and every step upwards represents more control, more stability, and more opportunity. Below the independence line, racing is a constant struggle to secure the next sponsor. Above it, you start building assets that work for you every day: your stories, your products, and your community. The path to a stronger, more accessible motorsport begins when more people start experimenting at every level of this model. And that experimentation, as I've said, is where the fun truly starts, because the options are only as limited as your imagination, sure, your budget, yes, and to bring this back to a more fundamental business level, the data you have on your target audience, because we always want to keep in mind who we're trying to speak to and ultimately who we're trying to sell to. So in part 4, the final part of Racing Second Revolution, we'll look at concrete examples of what this transformation could look like for teams and drivers willing to be as brave off track as they are on it. And that's it for today's episode of Return on Racing. As usual, I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time here with me. If you like these insights and want to have more of them delivered directly to you, I invite you to check out the Return on Racing newsletter. This is a newsletter delivered to your inbox every Sunday with quick, actionable insights that you can apply immediately to your motorsport operations. If you're interested in finding out more or even signing up, you can do so from the front page of the Voce Analytics website, and I will link to the link to do that directly via the show notes. And I'll also link to the previous parts of this series. Again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me here today on Return on Racing, and I very much look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.